It's working. Shall we start? Oh, good.
Is this on?
Lennie's also joined us.
It's on?
Can you hear us, Lennie?
Can, yes. Thank you.
That's great. Okay, hi.
You-
Yeah, I can
Hi.
see you straight
Can you
ahead of me. Okay, so it's a very special day today. So this is a very special session because we are celebrating 40 years of feminist publishing in India. It's 40 years ago that the first feminist press that continued right across the country, spreading its books right across the country and the world for so many years, Kali for Women was started. And also very special because we have with us Lennie Goodings of the Virago Press, which had already started in '73. And then you've got two people, slightly younger, who were readers of all these wonderful books that began to come out, and who later did make a small claim to scholarship in this case, and a bigger claim to scholarship in that case. So in '73, when Virago Press started, you did have some feminist publishing going on here in terms of little magazines in the regional languages, in Marathi, some in Bangla maybe, some in other. But this was, Kali for Women was the first press that sustained itself publishing books across so many years. So I'll begin with Lennie today because Lennie, you came first, or Virago came first. We can't see Lennie. Is she there online? Yeah?
I'm here. Can you not see me?
Okay. So Lennie
You can't
Goodings,
see me. Well,
thank you. Yeah. So Lennie Goodings, as you all know, is the chair of Virago Press, has been the chair of Virago Press since 2017. But she joined Virago within 5 years of its publishing, and Virago had been set up in a very, very interesting period, and I hope you'll tell us more about that period too. During and after the women's lib, when after the 60s, women had begun to realize that the 60s had not changed much for them, and Virago Press started with a commitment to giving women a voice, to bringing their history to the center, to the mainstream, and also through the combination of history and activism, beginning to change the pages of history. And in fact, there's a lovely, lovely, lovely film online that I saw a few days ago, and I'll highly recommend that. It's called Virago, Changing the World One Page at a Time. And it's just an amazing documentary on them. And I almost feel I know many of you now thanks to that, because it's very candid also in terms of the ups and downs of the press. And Urvashi, for those of us in the women's movement or women's studies movement, we've all been engaging with her over the decades because she's a feminist. She's one of our most dearly loved and highly respected feminist publishers, but she's also been a major activist all along and actually inspired people of my generation and younger ones too. I mean, I call her a friend and argue with her now, but that's another matter. And Urvashi is also a writer, as all of you know, with the book The Other Side of Silence. And she's brought together publishing and activism in some of the most wonderful ways, organizing workshops, organizing gatherings, organizing meetings that have reinforced the women's movement in many ways. And Lennie too is a writer, and she's done one book on children, and she's done another one on the history of Virago, which of course I have not read and I'm dying to read now, so that's going to be the next project, getting hold of it. It's called A Bite of the Apple, Behind the Scenes at Virago Press. So we have with us today people who are publishers and writers and activists, and Kali for Women also started up in the midst of a very, very tumultuous time in this country. And, the phase of the women's movement that actually began to confront violence against women, first in police custody and then in homes, in the context of sati, in the context of bride burning, sorry. So Kali for Women began to play a very important role then. And Jael here is a women's studies scholar and activist a writer, a painter. Jael wears many hats too. And Jael was a student in the 70s in the US when Virago first began publishing. I was a student here in the 80s here and the US when Kali first began publishing. So both of us will also respond as students and how we and our generation received these books. So let me start with what I'll also do is I'll just throw up a few questions regarding the things I think we might want to know. And if you address some of them, and others, of course, that you may want to, then we can have a conversation going around those. So one is, why were you all drawn to feminist publishing as publishers and readers? And what was significant about it for you across your lives? What were the obstacles? What were your highs? Let's start with those questions, very broad, general questions, and then we'll go on to other ones. So, Lennie, would you like to start?
Right, well, am I a sort of disembodied voice, I think? No thanks, but anyway, I'm there. I'm watching you. Thank you very much, first of all, especially to Urvashi, who reached out to me and asked me to be part of this. I came to feminism from Canada. I came to the UK and in the end of the 70s. And as you said in your introduction, it looked like we'd been through the 60s, and it looked like, we had a dawning of a new world. But as Carmen Khalil put it, who set up the Virago, as you said, she said what she felt that came out of the 60s was that nobody was still listening to women. So that, yes, you had all the social movements, etc., but women were making the tea and not getting their voices. And one of the things she said is that she wanted to hear women's opinions, women's history, women's lives, women's stories, women's opinions. And I always love that line because it feels like opinions, seems sort of rather marginal compared to history and, the big stories. But actually, if you look back to that period, women's opinions were not heard, actually. And I think one of the great things one of the reasons they weren't heard is that women themselves didn't think their opinions mattered. We were taught that we were not. We were sort of second-class citizens. And I think one of the great things that feminism has done throughout the world, actually, and you can see it right through up to more recently Me Too, is say to women, your voice does matter. What you've lived, what you've seen, what you want to say does matter. But it doesn't just matter to you on the outside, on the margins. It matters to everybody. And as you also said, one of the great goals of Virago always was to bring what was regarded as niche or marginal to the center and say, this matters to everybody.
Urvashi, would you like to continue?
Okay, thanks, Lennie. Can you hear me? Yeah? We can actually see you, so don't worry. We can see you. You're on the screen. So you're not just a disembodied voice. You're an actual presence, just divided by the screen. So hi, everyone. As Kavi has explained, I'm a feminist publisher, and I co-founded in 1984 the first feminist publishing house in India. And in 2003, the two founders, myself and my colleague Ritu Menon, we split and we each founded another publishing imprint, both feminist. So in a sense, the split was tragic because women's business broke up and everybody thought, oh, women can't get along with each other. But it was also very productive because we had two where there was earlier one, and the market was big enough to absorb both of those and others who were doing work. Kavita's question about what it was that pushed people like Lennie and me into feminist publishing. So for me, I was at university in the 70s in this country, and that was a very, very exciting and productive and interesting time politically, because it was 20 plus years after independence. The dreams of independence had begun to wear thin a little bit. Women were realizing that many of the promises that had been made about citizenship, about rights, etc., were not being fulfilled. They were also seeing that whereas the men in their families, their husbands and others, were able to enter politics or governance or the state or business industry, they didn't get anywhere. And they, unlike in the times of the British where they could fight and protest against the common enemy, they could not really address protest towards their husbands and people in their own families. So at one level that was happening. At another level, on the ground across India, you were seeing a lot of popular movements, starting from Maharashtra in the late 60s, post the famine and drought, where peasants were fighting in a large movement known as Shahada, where the participation was mostly of women, and the movement grew out of the sexual exploitation of peasant women. And you got thousands and thousands, like 25, 30, 40,000 women out in the streets. You had the anti-price rise movement also in the West, which was an all-woman movement. You had something called the Navnirman movement, which was a right-wing, mostly movement made up of students, but a huge participation of women. You had Naxalbari in this part of the world, some considerable participation of women. You had Chipko up in the north, which was an all-woman movement. And across India, you had protests in which women were involved, and in which women were finding that while they were involved with men who they might call progressive, their partners, their friends, etc., when it came to the victories of those movements, they were marginalized. So in Bihar, you have a big movement led by Jayaprakash Narayan, which is a movement called the Bodh Gaya movement, which is to grab land back from rich farmers who have acres and acres of lands while the peasants are suffering. And it was addressed to a religious organization where the students managed to take back 5,000 acres of land. But when that land was redistributed, it was distributed in the men's name, and women then started to fight, saying, what about us? So in all these political movements, women were raising questions of patriarchy even within progressive movements and articulating those. And it was a time when people like me who were in university were very touched and moved by what was going on in these movements. Some of my colleagues left and joined. Others like me didn't leave and join, but we started feminist organizations, feminist magazines. You've mentioned some magazines which already existed at that time. And then what happened for me, personally, fortuitously, was that I was studying literature at university. And when you study literature, at that time, you were expected to teach literature, and we were still in the throes of colonialism, so it was English literature. So I was living my life with Spencer and Milton, where they had nothing to do with the realities I was facing. And I was determined that I would not teach Spencer and Milton, even if it killed me. As it happened, sheer chance, I found a job in publishing, where Oxford University Press was adapting English textbooks to India. So my job was to change John and Mary to Ram and Sita by pasting Ram and Sita over John and Mary. And there was an artist employed whose job was to color blonde hair black and blue eyes black and to cut off the tops of double-decker buses. So this is the job, inglorious job I was doing, and I completely, utterly fell in love with publishing, decided this is where I want to be all my life. And outside of us, there was a strong women's movement in which I was involved. And so somehow for me, those three things came together, because in the women's movement, the questions that we were raising, we had no literature, no information, no books, nothing. And so I began to ask, why didn't we have work by women? And my bosses said, oh, women, do they read, do they write? And so I thought, okay, the hell with them, I'll do it myself. And that's how I thought of starting a feminist publishing house. I won't go on much longer. Just one thing, you said, what were the challenges? The biggest challenge, which I never expected, was getting women to believe in themselves and to see that what they had to say was important and worth hearing. What Lennie talked about, opinions. They had experiences, but they thought, oh, this is not worth talking about because nobody's going to listen to me.
Yeah, I'll come to you in 1 second. But because Urvashi brought this up just now, what I want to add here is, as a student in the late 70s, when I first began to read the books that began to come out of Kali for Women, which, as Urvashi said, Urvashi and Ritu Menon had started together, I can't tell you how excited I was, especially in the 80s when one began to read books like Recasting Women, because not only were we hearing feminists write about women's lives, it was a different way of looking at the world altogether. What I think people in Recasting Women were doing was retrieving a history from below in the tradition of the E.P. Thompson, the making of the English working class, the Genoveses who were writing slave history, where you're not imposing theory from above, where you're very well informed theoretically, but you're allowing the insights to grow from the ground level. And I think that's one of the reasons why women's studies took off in such a big way in this country. It was the influence of approaches like that. It wasn't just the contents of one particular book, but the approaches that were set at that time that allowed us to hear women's voices, their perspectives, their visions in far better a way than we would have a bit taken the top-down approach. So that was very, very important.
Okay, so I'm going to situate myself. 1974, I was a student. I had come from Calcutta, from India, via Ireland for 2 years, where I did my A-levels. Really didn't have a sense of the women's movement, and luck we have it, I was in a women's college, which was Wellesley College, the college that Hillary Clinton, we now know, went to, but it was a time of incredible ferment. I mean, there was lesbian activism on campus, there were women wanting to know themselves, there was Take Back the Night. This is way back in 1974. And Wellesley College is situated in Massachusetts, which is not far from Boston. So in 1969, for example, the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, Our Bodies Ourselves, that famous book had just come out, and people wanted to know about their bodies, about ourselves. It was already becoming a major hit. Eventually, it went on to sell over 1 million copies, and it was in 33 languages. So even from the very beginning, Judy Nosijan and the Boston Women's Health Book Collective did have a global perspective, that they were part of a movement that was much beyond the United States. It was exciting for a foreign student like me, because it wasn't only about white women and their bodies, but there was also a sensitivity to women from other parts of the world. At that time also, 1973, the abortion rights struggle, Roe versus Wade, had just been passed. So we were talking about women's rights to have an abortion on campus, which was a big issue for all of us, because that was not a right that we took for granted. At the same time, the beginnings of the talk about violence against women. Before violence against women, we didn't have a term for domestic violence at that period of time. People were not talking about it. If there was violence against women, there was some mental problem or something that was very rare. People really hadn't studied it, weren't looking at the impact about violence against women. So as students at Wellesley, we were really beginning to open up and realize about the radical notion that our issues mattered, that people cared about them, and we had something to say. 1975 was the Mexico Women's Conference, my second year at Wellesley, at sophomore, and my professor, Carolyn Elliott, had gone to the International Women's Conference. It was the first one in 1975, and she came back and she talked about, you know, women's movements in different parts of the world, and she asked us to do our papers on the particular countries we come from. Wellesley had a lot of different foreign students, but there was no literature. There was nothing really in 1975. Statistics wasn't disaggregated. We really couldn't get a sense of the women's movement in India. Veena and all hadn't really started publishing at that time, so there was a blank there. But there was an excitement among us that, you know, we could find out. We wanted to know more about women at the time. So that was the environment in which we expected now and demanded to be part of the canon, to be part of studies. And in 1970, I think it was the first women's studies publishing house opened in America. That was Florence Howe, the Feminist Press. And basically, it was also a college campus affair in a sense. She went to her students and she was teaching them about women in literature and about literature. And the students asked, where are the women? And she was like, I can't find them. All those stories about women and their histories are hidden. They're no longer there. Their work has not been republished. We'll have to do something about it. And she tried to make attempts to bring women's literature to become more published, but she couldn't get a mainstream publisher. And so basically, she called about 25 women to her house. 50 of them showed up, and they decided to start their own press. And that was the first press for women in 1970, the Feminist Press. So just 4 years into college. So it was actually such an exhilarating and exciting time, because unlike today, where things seem to be shutting down, things just kept seeming to be opening up in enormous kind of ways. And then within 2 years, there was the first Women's Studies Quarterly that was started. Women's Studies was not yet a subject, but it was going to be rapidly mushrooming in the time I was there. So I would say the 1975 to 77, when I was at Wellesley College, was a very exciting period of time, especially on the East Coast. And then briefly want to mention as well that Ms. Magazine, which nobody thinks is an important magazine now, but was very important then, was the first national magazine for women, was actually published during that period of time. And I don't know if you know, the first cover of Women's Magazine had a Kali, a woman Kali on it, and as a pregnant Kali, and she had 8 hands, and in one she had a clock, and in another she had a rake, and another she had a typewriter. And so this notion that women are not known for all the multitudes of jobs that they actually carry out and do. And again, as an Indian student there, that was exciting to see a representation of an image that was familiar to us, even in an international magazine. Now, this was all happening
Something,
Huh?
something you said.
Yeah.
Take back to Urvashi, so once you finish.
Yeah, so let me stop there.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back. Jael began to talk about our bodies, our lives, etc. And that reminded me of Sharir Ki Jankari that Kali for Women had published, which created publishing history of a very interesting kind. So if we talk about the publishing histories of feminist publishing, of Virago and Kali, what was special about that? And then Lennie, I'd like to ask you also what was unique about Virago's publishing history.
So what Kavita is talking about is a book that we published in the mid-80s, which is in Hindi, and it was later translated into many languages, called Sharir Ki Jankari, which means knowledge of your body. And it was a book that was put together by 75 village women from Rajasthan who were part of a government development program and who did some workshops on health, and then they created this book. The book came to us completely, well, it came to us because we were the only feminist publishers around, I suppose. And the way it happened was that we were sitting in our office one winter afternoon, and we were sitting out in the sun, because at that time the sun used to shine in Delhi winters. Now it doesn't. We have pollution. But we were sitting out in the sun, and this group of women walked in. There were 4 of them dressed in the traditional clothes of Rajasthan, and 4 were the activists that we knew from the women's health movement. And they said to us, oh, we've created this book and we want to know if you can publish it. And we made it by hand. They had made 2 copies by hand, and then they had tested it in the village. There are many stories about this book, but I'll tell you just the one story, because otherwise I can take up all the time. When they tested it in the village, everyone laughed at them and said, how can you call this a realistic book? Because it showed the naked body of the woman and the man, because it's a book about your body, so you have to see the body. And everyone in the village said, you never see a naked woman in a village, so how can you call this realistic? And so the authors went back to the drawing board and they thought about it, and they came up with this completely ingenious solution, which was that they made a woman fully dressed in the traditional clothes, the long skirt, the blouse, the head covered, and then there was a little flap. You could lift up the skirt and you could see how she was made from inside. And the man too. So they didn't leave Mr. Man alone, because the man in the village is dressed in a dhoti, which is the lower garment, and his chest is bare. Men can have chests bare because in those days they didn't have breasts as large as women. Today they often do, but they can still have their chests bare. And he would be wearing a turban. So what they did was they dressed the man in the dhoti, and then you could lift up the dhoti and you could see how he was made from inside. And then they showed all the little stages of, and it's shocking, so all the little stages of what happens, and then, when things escape from the man's body, then you can see them with ribbons to show the X and without ribbons to show the Y, or the other way around or whatever. So it was a wonderful, wonderful book. And they said to us, we want you to publish this, but we have 2 conditions to the publishing. And we had never had an author come in and say, I have conditions. And we had been feeling that we publish in English mostly. So we'd been feeling that while we were publishing in English, what were we doing being a feminist publisher in a multilingual country, sitting in Delhi and publishing only in English? So this book was like every feminist publisher's dream. And the 2 conditions they imposed on us was, one, that we will not sell any copy of the book ever to a village woman at a profit. We'll sell it at cost. We could sell it in a bookshop at a profit. And 2, that there were 75 authors and all 75 wanted their names on the cover. So it was a real education for us to think of authorship collectively. We did put all 75 names on the cover at the back, and we didn't put any author's name on the cover in the front, just the title. And we met their conditions, and that has been our best-selling and our most important political book to date.
So for a niche publisher, how many copies did you sell of this book? How many thousands, roughly?
I think we sold about 80,000.
Wow.
I think it was pirated across the board, including, I think, by the Rajasthan government, because it was very easy to pick up and print, and it's been translated into many languages. Some we know of, some we don't know of. What's also very interesting is not a single copy has sold through a bookshop. It's always only gone direct to the women who use it.
So Lennie, I'm sure you have a very different story, but what is your perspective on this, in terms of feminist publishing? How was Virago different? What was unique about it?
Well, I was glad you mentioned the magazines that you had in your country and also in America. And Ms. Magazine, as you said, that came out in 1972, and in England, in Britain, Spare Rib, which was our first magazine, came out the same year. And both of those had the same sort of mission statement, which was, again, it wasn't going to be niche. Both of those magazines said that it weren't just for feminists, they were for all women. And I think that that conversation really started up the feminist presses, actually. And I think I'm liking the sort of spirit that you just talked about, Urvashi, from the women. If you look at some of the titles that all of us went for, Virago means heroic woman. And in America, they had Kitchen Table Press and Shameless Hussy and things like that. There was a really provocative, wanting to be funny, but, serious, showing the serious side too. And our first books, we're also, we didn't have anybody marching in. I'd love to have had that, but our first books were called The Fen Women. And that was, the Fens are an East Anglian part of Britain, and it was the story of a village. And it was the same kind of thing that you just talked about, actually, is that people thought, this isn't worth putting, these are just ordinary women's story, ordinary lives, what you do every day, wasn't thought to be worthy of a book. Soon after that, we also did a sex education book called Make It Happy by Jane Cousins, and which was denounced in the House of Commons because it didn't mention marriage. And people got very hot under the collar for that. And I think that is the kind of, when you look back on these things, they seem slightly mild, don't they? But at the time, they were the people were a combination of excited, even if you were, what I sort of characterize as a lot of women sort of cheered us on from the sidelines, but were nervous themselves to call themselves feminists, but would, wanted to buy our books, followed the next green spines. We always had green spines in those days. They were part of it. You felt that they were part of it, but there was, as you also said, Urvashi, there was tension, and there were more radical presses than Virago in the early days who felt that Virago, wanting to be a mainstream press, as I said, our sort of mission was like Ms. and Spare Rib to bring the women's stories to the center, say that they were important as anything else. But some of the more radical presses felt that was, a sellout. I remember being asked, what do you say to the accusation that Virago is the acceptable face of feminism? And which I wanted to say, it's great. We got to have, the way you make changes, it's got to be right from the grassroots to the top, doesn't it? And then we'd have the mainstream press would call us paper typists. So you could see we were walking a very interesting line between wanting to be mainstream, wanting to bring the radical to the mainstream, being criticized by the radical, and also being a bit frightened by the mainstream being frightened by us. Quite an exhilarating time, I have to say.
So, so you've both published, starting from these early examples you talked about, you've published lots of amazing literature. You've published literature from the margins too. You've done retrieval of literature. You've also done work on health, on economics, on women's movements, on sexuality. At this point in time, where do you think feminist publishing is going? If you could just, all three of you, if you could just tell me in 1 minute each, because then we've got the audience and we've got to come back. So what is your sharpest understanding of where you think the women's movement's going? The feminist publishing is going, sorry. Yael first.
I don't think I'm equipped because I'm not a feminist publisher, but I think it's a real challenge for feminist publishers because right now women's writing, women's voices are right all over the place. And so to find a particular niche for feminist presses, I think are going to become more and more difficult. How do they actually articulate themselves differently from the many other presses and the political presses that are out there? But that's my impression from the outside.
No, I think, Yael, you're right in the sense that I mean, when Lennie started, when Virago started, when we started, in a sense, we were the only ones that women had the possibility of going to get published. In England, you had a greater variety than we did in India. In India, it was just Kali for a start, and then Mandira came in with her imprints, 3, and a few other people came in later. So, but then what's happened is that women's writing has become, within quotes, mainstream over the last, let's say, 40 years, and many big publishers are now publishing women. So the same authors that we published no longer are with us because they have greater opportunities. And when you stop getting infuriated by that desertion, within quotes, then you realize it's what you set out to do anyway, to mainstream women. And if they are going to mainstream publishers, then that is a good thing. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a role. We have a role to constantly find new voices and bring them to public attention. Of course, that role doesn't earn us any money. So you're absolutely right to say, economically, it is so difficult. It is much, much more difficult today, economically, for us than it was when we started to survive. So I don't know how long we'll survive. But anyway, never mind. If we die tomorrow, at least we'll have done a damn good job of what we did. And that's
Are younger feminists pushing you in different directions? Are younger feminists pushing you in different directions?
Younger feminists are. They're bringing their concerns to attention. And those do need to be written up and published. But there are also so many more avenues, you know, discussions on the net, there's digital publishing, there's audio publishing. And the book itself in the traditional form, while it'll never disappear and people love it and they love it, but it's still having to be in a playing field which has got many more things in it, if you like.
Actually, I don't agree from my perspective. I think we are still very relevant. I think you know, we're a different size. Virago is a very big publishing house. We've published over 4,000 books by now. And also we're supported in a different way. You know, we're not independent. We're part of a larger organization, which certainly helps. But I think that's not just about an appetite for feminist books. That's an appetite for literary books too. You know, you need to be supported commercially, it seems to me. But what I feel is, you know, we use the words ebb, you know, the waves rather, about feminism. You know, Urvashi and I came in this, well, we all did, didn't we, in the second wave of feminism. And now we're sort of, in the UK, they talk about the fourth or the fifth wave of feminism. And I think that when you talk about waves, it automatically implies ebbs and flows. And it seems to me the thing that a feminist press, an avowedly feminist press, can do, and that's what we believe at Virago, is you hold the line. You know, you don't, because things are fashionable. Yes, it's true that, you know, I'm obviously, women are published everywhere. I'm not saying that's a fashion. But certain kinds of topics are fashion. Feminist history became a big fashion a couple of years ago here. and then it goes out of fashion. And what something like Virago do is we don't go out of fashion. We don't follow the fashions. We stay abreast of the latest gender politics, the latest literature, etc. You know, obviously you've got to stay, your profile matters hugely, doesn't it? You have to protect your reputation. You have to be relevant. But what I do think is you don't just roll over when things change. And, you know, I watched that through the 90s in the UK. There sort of became ladettes, you know, women were embarrassed to use the word feminism, and we kept on. And then, lo and behold, you know, the next wave of feminism arrived because the young women thought, wait a minute, there's still sexism. We still do need feminism. We still need voices. We still need the beacons that I think of as women's presses, as who stand up for women, who stand up unabashedly, immodestly, and point out these are the voices that need to be heard. So I know we go through rough patches, but I think we're far from finished.
Lennie, I'm not saying that we are not relevant. All I'm saying is, yes, of course we're relevant. We have to find new things, and we will find new things, and we are doing that. What I'm saying is that it isn't that easy economically for independent presses. You're in a different situation, right? You're with a big unit, so you're protected by that. For us, the funds are very much more difficult. So I don't know how long we'll survive, but that doesn't make the work irrelevant. So that's, yeah.
You're right.
Okay, before we go on to the audience, I think I'd like to ask each one of you to tell us a little story about one of your most memorable moments in publishing during your experience. So, Jael.
Okay, I'm going to put on a donor's hat over here because I did work as a donor for about 12
1 minute
or
each.
15 years. I was with the Ford Foundation, and I think the donor's hat would tell me that the Feminist Press, Ms. Magazine, all the important presses, and we failed to talk enough about the kitchen table press, which was really important at the time because black women were not represented much in second wave feminism, and I'd hoped to talk about that as well. But they were not funded by the Ford Foundation. But with my hat, I would say that it was a consistent, long-term support of foundations in the States that really made a difference to the feminist organizations, to the feminist presses, at least in the United States. And it was really hard, even in 2003, 2005, Boston Women's Health Book Collective, it wasn't a feminist press, but they dissolved. They just didn't have the funding anymore from Ford to go on. Feminist press was struggling for money, Ms. Foundation. So I think to have long-term support for important work like this, where you're breaking new ground, is really important. And one of the hardest things for me was to say no, that Ford was no longer able to support that kind of work.
Lennie, would you like to share something with us in terms of what's been most memorable for you?
I would say, in terms of one of the authors who sort of just changed my life, really, is when we first started publishing Maya Angelou. And she told us that her book had been sent all around the UK publishers, and everybody said nobody's interested in the story of a young black girl growing up in America. And then we published her in 1984, and the world changed. My world changed through her. But also it happened in 1984 is the thing, Urvashi and I, how we first met, actually, because we were both part of the International Feminist Book Fair in the UK. And that was so exciting, wasn't it, Urvashi? We filled halls. We had a huge number of mainstream and radical presses all come together, show their wares. But we got some things really wrong. You know, it was pretty understanding from a white feminist point of view, intersectionality. And we had Audre Lorde came and said there are not enough people of color on your board deciding what happens. We unbelievably, it seems now, we put the fair in a hall that had a huge staircase so that the women who were disabled found it really difficult to get upstairs. And those kinds of things were absolutely shaming, but also incredibly, I would say a very tough way to learn, but very big lessons for me, and it changed my life.
Thank you for that very, very candid response. I think these things affect us. Yeah. Urvashi, your turn.
Okay, so I would have told you about the story that I've already told you because that was a really memorable story for us and that changed the course of my publishing. But I'm going to tell you two little other stories about the difficulty that we had in the early days getting women to write. I mentioned that, and getting women to believe in themselves, but also getting women to produce books on time because they had so many household responsibilities. So, Kavita, the book you talked about, Recasting Women, which became one of our classics and we published in 1989 and remains in print today, I had to trap the two editors in my house, and I was the only person in the feminist thing who had a computer at that time, which was an old computer called an Amstrad. And I gave them that, and I babysat the son of one of them while they wrote the introduction. I made them endless cups of tea and I would not let them get out. They hated me for it, but the introduction got written. And then I had to work on another book, which was our dream book, History of the Women's Movement, called The History of Doing, which was published in '93 and remains in print today. And the author, Radha Kumar, would sleep at 2 o'clock at night and would wake up at 12 or 1 or 2, and folded over all the sofas in her house would be various young men and women in states of stupor, having been high on dope or something else. And I would arrive there with my clipboard and my notes because I needed Radha to discuss the next chapter with me. Then I'd sit by her bed and wait for her to wake up. I had to make lots of glasses of black coffee and make them cold so that when she woke up, she could drink them cold. And she hated me for it. You know, it was such a tense relationship that she used to get really angry with me. What is this person doing here? And all those people would look at me like I was really crap, coming into their wonderful lives and with my clipboard and looking efficient. But the book got written, it got published, and it has never gone out of print. So today we are friends, but then we were a little bit at odds with each other.
That's such a wonderful story. Yeah, and what better illustrations can you get about how the personal shapes the political? You literally invade the person's private domain and shape it. So, yeah, I think it's time for audience reactions, audience questions, actually. So, but please make your questions really short. 1 or 2 sentences each, not more than that, so that more people can get a chance. Please start. Yeah. And tell us who your question is for. Anjum, you had a question? Okay, let's start with Anjum. Say it and I'll repeat it.
You constantly hear writers talking about the fact that they don't want to be thought of as women writers in some sort of a ghettoized world. They don't want a separate kind of consideration. They want to be considered writers along with everybody else. Now, when that starts to happen, where does that put the impulse to have a feminist publishing press?
Should we take 2, 3 questions and then respond? I think that may be better, no?
Any other questions? We're taking 2, 3 questions together. Yes, that gentleman there, and then this. What's your name? Koni.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I have this question, which is like, I mean, you've been speaking about feminism movement, which started in the 70s, which is about 50 years ago. So in the past 50 years, I mean, how much do you think the definition and issues of feminism have really changed? And I mean, there are issues where you say the more they change, the more they remain the same. I mean, I would certainly agree to a part of it. And also, I mean, with readership dwindling drastically, attention spans lowering on a daily basis, how are the authors and publishers coping with this change?
Thanks. My question...
Lennie, can you hear the questions? Are the
can.
questions audible? Can you hear them? Yeah.
Yes, I can.
So my question to everyone on the panel is, my sense is that we've lost a lot of ground from the 60s and 70s in the advancement of women, or actually in terms of women's choices of how they wish to handle their lives vis-a-vis, I'm specifically talking of legislation in the US on abortion and other things. So how do you feel going forward? What should the focuses be on the progression of women and really mainstreaming women as they should be?
Can I just respond to Anjum's question? Because I think what's important about the feminist press is they were overtly political. They were an arm of the women's movement. At least that was the situation in the context of India and also the United States, okay? That may be different for other countries. So when you said women don't want to be known as women writers, I think women writers and feminist writers are quite distinct in many ways. And I think that the women's presses, what they did do was actually go for very deliberate feminist movement kind of writing where they're breaking boundaries. Women writer can be writing about all kinds of things which have nothing maybe to do with women's movement at all. They could be writing detective mysteries. And so I think, I think we need to make a clear distinction between women writers and feminist writers and what's the role of a feminist press and a general press. So I just want to respond to that.
Lennie, would you like to take any of the questions?
But I mean, I'm very interested in the definition. I don't actually agree with you about whether you're a feminist writer or a women writer, to be honest, because what I think is we still have, what we really need to call attention to is when we say author, we generally mean man, and we often mean white man. And that person never gets a qualifier. That person never gets, the rest of us get Canadian writer, Indian writer, LGBT gay writer, whatever, woman writer, but the word author still, to me, in this country anyway, you'll tell me differently, means man. So when I think our jobs as feminist publishers, as women's publishers, is to call that out. I would like it too, that when you say author, it could mean anybody. It doesn't need its adjective, but most of us have adjectives still. And when you have that adjective on the front of it, it actually says you are only writing for the people who are like you. If you're a woman writer, you're writing for other women. If you're a gay writer, you're writing for other gay or queer. And I think that's the kind of thing we all have to challenge. I think you're absolutely right about women losing ground to that last question. And I think that's what I meant about we have to hold the line. You can't see yourself as a fashion. You have to stay strong, but you have to move. I mean, the younger women at Virago, for example, we have now redefined what we publish. It's women and underrepresented genders. You have to change. You have to let the next wave of feminists decide what is feminism and decide what is important. I think those are my two things I want to say.
Okay, so Lennie's answered Anjum's question, so I'm not going to go into that. I'll just address the two questions, the question that you asked. I think the thing is that feminism over the years will inevitably grow and evolve, and new issues will come up. And that is as it should be, because as our understanding and experience grows, the issues become more complex. And as Lennie has just said, for example, we can, even though we are feminist publishers, we can no longer talk only about women, but we have to talk of the whole spectrum of identities along that, the binary from men to women, because that is how the question of identity has developed and changed. So there will be changes all the time. There will be growth. There will be deepening understanding. That doesn't mean that the old issues have gone away, sadly, because if we could say, oh, we sorted the question of violence against women, and now let's move on to XYZ, no, we can't say that. But our understanding of violence against women in the 70s and our understanding of violence against women today is a much more developed, evolved, conceptual understanding of the structures and systems and so on and so forth. And therefore it becomes more interesting, more complex, more difficult to address them, and therefore it becomes much more difficult to map change to measure it. How do you measure it? What do you say? Do you measure it statistically? Do you measure it experientially? Because all those things are being questioned. Statistics tell us one story. It is always an incomplete story. And therefore, I think we just have to see this as something that is growing. And in that context, I think losing ground, yes. I'm not sure how much ground we have lost in India, but I can't say that we have gained a lot either, although I think we have gained some. But I think what we can say, so I wouldn't look at it as losing ground, I would look at it as the huge backlash, which is coming in very different forms than what we anticipated or expected, including, for example, with the rise of fundamentalist right-wing states, deeply patriarchal, deeply masculinist. What is going to happen to this battle that we are trying to fight for the rights of women? And we will have to fight many different battles. So I'm not sure we've lost ground, because with that kind of opposition, holding ground is also very difficult, which is what Lennie was pointing out. And if we can hold ground, I think we're okay. You know, that's the best we can do, but we will do more over time.
Thank you so much, all of you. And, you know, when Urvashi was saying that we've done our bit, you've done much more than your bit, and all of you, Jael, you, Lennie, you, because I was just thinking about this whole question of holding ground and how difficult it's going to be to hold ground. And I think one of the most important things here is to know our histories. Because I think we're losing out on our understanding of our histories, because there's less and less history being taught in universities, with the focus on questions of gender, questions of sexuality, questions of development, questions of identity, questions of race. History somewhere is beginning to get short shrift, and I know that from our students. And I think it's so crucial to get back to our histories and understand how we came where we came, because that really deepens our valuation of our histories. And you know, it's folks like you who've brought these histories to our tables, you know, through your books, through your funding, through whatever actions. So it's up to the rest of us now to keep reading these histories and have our histories transmitted to the next generation. Because unless we keep in mind all that's gone into bringing us where we are, there's a chance of losing it, and we definitely don't want to do that. So thank you so much, all of you, today. It was really wonderful. And Urvashi, I think you would like to say something. No?
Thanks,
Okay.
Lennie.
Thank you. Lennie, would you like to say something before we go on?
I'm just very flattered to be invited. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for joining us, Lennie.